The river had been there the whole time. I had walked its bank 100 times in the months since we first broke ground on the workshop, measuring the current with a stick and a count of seconds, pacing the drop between the upper bend and the lower pool, sketching numbers in the margins of my survey notes. Every time I looked at it, I felt the same mild irritation at myself, the way you feel when you realize the tool you needed was sitting on the bench behind you the whole afternoon. The water pushes the blades turn a shaft, and that shaft never sleeps, never tires, never asks for bread. The hardest worker in the valley, and it had been there the whole time. We broke the wheel frame from pine and elm, the straightest timber Mok Jae could drag out of the upper ridge in 3 days of hauling. The paddles were mortised into the rim in pairs, each one angled to catch the current at the shoulder, and shedded clean at the bottom. A geometry I had worked out on paper, and then reworked with Wol-yeong, who had a way of feeling the right curve in a piece of wood before the chisel touched it. The hub and the main shaft were iron, shop-made. Baek Tae-ho had spent the better part of a week at the Great Forge drawing down a billet into something I could actually true up on the lathe, and we had fitted the hub with a shrink press that would have made my grandfather nod. It was not elegant. It was heavy where it should have been lighter, and the journal bearings were babbitt poured into wooden housings that I was not entirely proud of. But the geometry was sound, and sound geometry forgives a great deal of roughness in the material. Baek Tae-ho stood back when we set the last spoke wedge and looked at the wheel the way he looked at a finished blade, not with admiration exactly, but with the particular attention of a man checking his own work for the flaw he knows he left somewhere. The oldest trick in the valley, he said, and it's what finally outpaces a forge full of strong backs. He was not wrong. We had been fighting the muscle bottleneck since the first week. Every gain in precision had demanded more turning, more grinding, more steady pressure at the wheel, and every hour of that was an hour a man spent cranking instead of thinking, teaching, or building the next thing. The wheel was the answer I had known was coming and kept deferring because the immediate problem was always more urgent than the structural one. That is the trap of bootstrap work. You are always one crisis behind the solution you actually need. The line shaft ran the length of the workshop ceiling, iron journals set into the ridge beam at intervals. The shaft itself, a series of coupled lengths that Mok Jae and I had aligned with a stretched cord and more patience than either of us had believed we possessed. From the shaft, leather belts dropped to every machine in the shop, the lathe, the milling frame, the grinding wheel, the drill press we had finished only the week before. The belts were cut from the best hide we could cure, spliced with riveted laps, tensioned with wooden idlers that could be nudged by hand. The whole arrangement looked, I knew, like something out of a woodcut from a book about mills, because that is exactly what it was. There was no cleverness in it. The cleverness had all been spent getting the machines themselves to the point where they were worth powering. Belt to the lathe, belt to the mill, belt to the grinder, all off the river. Nobody would pump a treadle in this shop ever again. The morning we opened the sluice, the whole workshop had gathered without anyone calling them. Word travels in a small place. Wol-yeong stood near the door with his arms folded, watching the ceiling shaft with an expression I had come to recognize as his version of anticipation. Very still, very focused, the way he went still when he was about to measure something important. Baek Tae-ho had positioned himself beside the great lathe with one hand resting on the tool rest, ready to feel the vibration through the iron. Even the two youngest apprentices had found reasons to be present, though they were pretending to sweep. Mok Jae was the one who pulled the sluice lever. The sound came first, a low building rush as the head race filled and the current found the paddles. Then the wheel began to move, slowly at first, each paddle dipping and lifting with a deliberateness that made it seem almost reluctant. Then the shaft caught the rhythm, and the belts came taut, one after another, and the machines woke up. The lathe spindle began to turn, the milling frame's cutter arbor spun up, the grinding wheel sang its dry note against the morning air, all of them running together, off nothing but the river and the geometry we had given it. Mok Jae let go of the lever and turned around with an expression that I do not have an engineer's word for. "They're all running," he said, "and nobody's cranking anything." Cho-young looked at the turning shaft overhead for a moment, then at the belts, then at the river visible through the open workshop door. "We taught the river to run the shop," he said. It was not a technical observation, but it was not wrong either. Muscle had built the first machines. That was the only way it could have gone. You need hands and backs and hours to make the tools that make the tools. But muscle is expensive. Muscle gets tired. Muscle has to eat, has to sleep, has to be trained and kept and paid in some form or another. And every hour of it spent turning a crank is an hour not spent on the work that only a thinking person can do. From that morning forward, the river carried the repetitive load, and the people in the shop were free to do the part only people can, to measure, to judge, to teach, to design the next iteration. The output numbers in the weeks that followed were not subtle. We were cutting threads faster, grinding surfaces flatter, drilling true holes in less time and with less error. The lathe ran at a consistent speed that no treadle pumping apprentice had ever managed to hold for more than a quarter hour together. Consistency is its own form of precision. It lets you learn from your measurements instead of chasing the variation in your power source. We were learning faster because the machine was steadier, and the machine was steadier because the river did not tire. I found myself standing at the workshop door one evening, watching the wheel turn in the last light, and thinking about what came after. Water today, steam tomorrow, and after steam, an engine small enough to put on wheels. A prime mover you could carry to the work, instead of bringing the work to the river. The sequence was clear to me, in the way that a machine surface is clear when you hold it to the light at the right angle. Not finished, but the path to finished visible in the grain of what's already done. It was all coming. The only question was time. Wol-yeong came to the workshop that same evening, which was not unusual. She had taken to walking the floor in the late hours, when the apprentices had gone and the machines were still. She had a way of seeing the shop that was different from mine, where I saw process and sequence, and the gap between where we were and where we needed to be. She saw what the shop looked like from the outside, from the court's vantage, from the perspective of someone who needed to explain Iron Ridge to people who had never held a caliper in their lives. She stood at the door and watched the wheel for a long time without speaking. I had learned not to fill her silences. What she was thinking, I could only partly read from her face. A town that powers itself off a river and makes its own steel and guns. That was not a tax problem anymore. That was something the court's old categories did not have a clean word for. A threat to the whole order was one way to put it. The way she stood, the set of her shoulders, told me she had already put it that way, and that the conclusion she had reached from it was not a comfortable one. She turned from the door and looked at me. "When they come," she said, "it'll be a court army. We have a season if we're lucky." I had known this was coming, not the specific shape of it, not the army, not the season, but the general shape, that a thing which works draws attention, and attention from the wrong quarter draws force. We had not been subtle. You cannot be subtle about a waterwheel. The sound of it carries. "Then the river turns out cannon now," I said, "and walls faced in iron." She waited. "We built tools to make a better life," I said. "Now we make them keep it." Ryu Gyeom's name had come up before in reports Wol-yeong brought back from her contacts in the capital, a court inspector whose mandate was fading along with the last of the old mandate's power, and who had watched that fading with the particular fury of a man who understands exactly what he is losing. He had come to Iron Ridge once, early on, and I had not been present for the meeting. G had described him afterward in 3 words: precise, frightened, dangerous. The combination, she had said, was worse than any one of them alone. What reached us now was not a visit, but a report of what he had said before the court, and G read it to me in the workshop, with the wheels still turning outside and the belts still running overhead, because there was no reason to stop the machines for bad news. He had named the stakes plainly, which I could not help but respect, even as I understood what it meant for us. They make with iron and number what we can barely do with blood, and they teach it to anyone. That was the part that frightened him most, I thought. Not the cannon, not the steel. The teaching, The fact that what we built here was not a secret held by one family or one guild, but a method, written down, demonstrated, passed from hand to hand. Burn it now while it is one town, or kneel to it within our lifetimes. He was not wrong about the stakes, he was only wrong about which side of them to stand on. That night the workshop ran past midnight. The wheel did not stop. There was no reason to stop it. The lathe cut barrel blanks by lamplight. The grinding wheel dressed the faces of the iron plate we were fitting to the outer wall. Mok Jae worked the milling frame until his eyes were red, and I sent him to sleep, and Wol-yeong took his place without being asked. I stood at the window and watched the wheel turn against the dark water, and thought about the shape of the next months. We were not racing the snow anymore. The snow had come and gone, and we had survived it. What we were racing now was an army, its pace of march, its supply lines, its political will, the time it would take Ryu Gyeom to move the court from words to action. A season, G had said, if we were lucky. The river did not care about any of that. It pushed the blades turned the shaft turned the belts turned the machines. It had been doing something like this in its own way for 1,000 years before we arrived, and it would do it long after whatever came next had resolved itself one way or another. We had only given it a purpose it could not have chosen for itself. That was the job. That had always been the job. I went back to the lathe and measured the bore of the barrel blank with the inside calipers, and the number was good, and I set the tool for the next pass, and the river kept turning the wheel all through the dark.